Summer 1943. Thousands of German soldiers captured in North Africa. Boarded Liberty ships bound for an unknown destination. Rumors spread. They were going to Britain, or maybe Siberia. Few guessed the truth. They were headed for America. The voyage was long and crowded. For 2 weeks, men slept in hammocks stacked like ladders, seasick and restless. When at last the ships reached the U.S. coast, the prisoners pressed to the rails, straining for their first glimpse of the enemy's homeland. They expected slums, poverty, a broken nation struggling under war. Instead, they saw sprawling ports, cranes unloading cargo day and night, endless automobiles, and cities alight with electricity. One soldier later wrote, "I believed America was decadent and weak. But when I saw Norfolk, I realized we had been lied to. They had everything: ships, machines, lights that never went out from the ports. Trains carried them deep into the countryside. Through the windows, they watched vast fields, modern tractors, and barns larger than some German factories. Their destination was a network of over 400 prison camps scattered across the United States. Some in forests, some on plains, some hidden near small towns where Americans had never met a German before. When the prisoners arrived, they braced for cruelty. They expected barbed cages, hunger, and beatings. Instead, guards spoke German, handed out blankets, and explained the rules of the Geneva Convention. The camps held barracks, mess halls, chapels, even libraries. Red Cross parcels supplied books and games. YMCA groups donated instruments and sports equipment. It was not freedom, but it was not misery either. As weeks passed, the men settled into camp life. They worked in fields or on lumber details, wrote censored letters home, and played soccer on open grounds. To their astonishment, the Americans enforced discipline, but rarely humiliation. In the evenings, they sang folk songs, carved wood, and shared stories of home. They remained enemies of the United States, but within the wire, they found a strange kind of stability. Still, birthdays came quietly. Men whispered the dates, sharing scraps of bread or an extra cigarette. They never expected recognition. A prisoner's birthday, they thought, was something captivity could erase. But America had surprises waiting. Soon guards and farmers would do the unthinkable. Allow, even encourage, prisoners to celebrate the milestones of their lives. One diary would later record the shock. "To be remembered on my birthday by the enemy was the strangest kindness of my life." The story of those birthdays, ordinary days made extraordinary in captivity, was about to unfold. Autumn 1943. In a camp deep in Texas, a prisoner named Wilhelm Krauss quietly mentioned to a bunkmate that it was his birthday. He expected nothing, perhaps a handshake, maybe an extra cigarette, if someone was generous. But word spread among the men. That evening, when Krauss returned from work detail, he found his barracks decorated with scraps of newspaper cut into ribbons. His comrades sang softly, clapping in rhythm. Instead of silence, the entire barracks joined in, turning a prisoner's birthday into a camp-wide event. It was small, simple. But to Krauss, it felt miraculous. One diary recorded, "They gave me a piece of their bread, pressed into my hand with a smile. It was more valuable than gold. For one night, I was not a prisoner, I was alive and remembered." The guards noticed the laughter and asked what was happening. When told they did something unexpected, they allowed the men to continue. No punishment, no interruption. Some even smiled, leaning on their rifles. The news spread quickly. Prisoners realized that birthdays could be celebrated without fear of reprisal. Within weeks, the camps began to mark them regularly. Men carved small gifts from wood scraps, figurines, rings, or pipes. Others offered sketches, handmade cards, or songs written for the occasion. These tokens carried more weight than material wealth. One American chaplain later wrote, "I watched German prisoners celebrate a birthday with nothing but bread and song. Their joy was so pure, it humbled me." As time went on, even the guards and farmers joined in subtle ways. A farmer might hand an extra peach to a prisoner on his birthday. A guard might allow an extra hour of song in the barracks. For men far from home, these moments felt impossible. The enemy was not only feeding them, but remembering them. A soldier later reflected, "To be celebrated in captivity was stranger than freedom. The Americans gave us back our days, one birthday at a time." What began as a whispered tradition would soon grow into something larger, events that included music, food, and gifts so generous they shocked even the hardest veterans of the Africa Corps. The first surprise was only the beginning, for soon birthdays in captivity would no longer be forgotten. They would become proof that even behind barbed wire, life could still be honored. As more birthdays came and went, the celebrations grew. Prisoners began to prepare weeks in advance, pooling small treasures, sugar, coffee, or tobacco to give as gifts. In a world where possessions were scarce, even a single cigarette wrapped in paper felt like a treasure. A tin of sardines from a Red Cross parcel became a banquet when shared on a birthday night. One diary described it this way: "The gifts were poor in value, but rich in meaning. A pipe carved from wood, a drawing of a homeland city, such things meant more than jewels. The camp's workshops became secret studios. Prisoners with skill in carpentry, painting, or tailoring created objects of beauty from scraps, rings from wire, chess pieces from bread, portraits from charcoal. Guards noticed these efforts. Some turned a blind eye, others quietly supplied pencils or wood offcuts. A few even asked to see the finished works, impressed by the prisoners' craftsmanship. On one occasion, an American guard smuggled extra rations to a barracks, whispering, 'Happy birthday,' in broken German. The gesture left the men stunned into silence. Farmers, too, became part of the tradition. Prisoners on work detail sometimes received an apple, an egg, or a slice of pie on their birthdays. These were small things, yet in wartime, they felt like miracles. One farmer's wife later recalled, "They were far from home. I thought of my own son overseas, so I baked them something small. I could not do less for the prisoners." These moments blurred the lines between captivity and community. Birthdays became a ritual that reminded them they were still individuals, not just numbers in a camp register. The celebrations often ended with songs, German folk tunes, sometimes joined by American hymns. In the glow of lanterns, the barbed wire seemed to vanish, if only for a night. A veteran later reflected, "The Americans gave us the space to remember who we were. Even the calendar was restored to us. Without birthdays, time would have been endless. With them, we measured life again." Behind barbed wire, gifts were not measured by cost, but by courage and care. And with each birthday marked, the prisoners grew less like captives and more like men again. But the greatest shock was still to come when entire camps began to turn birthdays into events that included guards, chaplains, and even music played on American instruments. For birthdays in captivity were about to grow louder, brighter, and more unforgettable. By 1944, birthdays had become more than quiet gatherings. They grew into evenings of music, laughter, and shared stories that filled the barracks with warmth. Prisoners who could play instruments formed small bands. Accordions, harmonicas, even makeshift guitars strung from scavenged wire provided music for birthday nights. The sound carried across the camp, drawing men from neighboring barracks. For a few hours, birthdays felt less like captivity and more like village festivals back home. One diary recorded, "They played folk songs from Bavaria and we sang until our throats ached. I closed my eyes and could almost believe I was home. Guards often lingered nearby, curious. Some clapped along, others requested American tunes. Eventually, the line between prisoner and captor blurred, if only for the length of a song. Farmers noticed, too. On work details, they sometimes asked prisoners if they had celebrated a birthday. When told, they nodded, occasionally adding, "Many happy returns," in hesitant German. In one camp, an American chaplain brought hymn books in German. During birthdays, men sang hymns of thanksgiving, their voices echoing across the compound like prayers carried on the wind. The laughter was contagious. Prisoners swapped jokes, told childhood stories, even imitated officers back home. For men stripped of freedom, humor became another form of resistance. A guard wrote in his journal, "It is a strange thing to see enemies laugh. They sound like our boys." In those moments, war feels very far away. On special occasions, the kitchens allowed prisoners to cook. They baked bread in shapes, stirred stews, and turned rations into feasts. Birthdays became a time when ordinary food tasted extraordinary. The celebrations often ended with speeches, simple words of gratitude, spoken in German, sometimes translated by bilingual guards. Each birthday reminded the men that they had survived another year. A veteran later reflected, "Our captors could not take time from us." Every birthday was proof that life continued. Even in prison, music, laughter, and food transformed the camps, if only briefly, into homes. But the celebrations carried a deeper meaning. They restored dignity to men who had been told they were nothing but prisoners. And soon, these birthdays would reveal an even greater shock, gifts and recognition, not only from fellow prisoners, but from the American captors themselves. At first, the guards watched birthdays from a distance, amused by the songs and laughter. But as months passed, some began to participate, quietly at first, then more openly. A sergeant, walking past a barracks one evening, slipped a pack of cigarettes through the door. He said nothing, only nodded when the men cheered. Later, prisoners discovered he had chosen the birthday boy as the recipient. One diary captured the moment. "The guard gave me tobacco. I had not smoked in months. He said only, 'Alles Gute,' in broken German. My eyes filled with tears." In another camp, guards allowed a record player into the barracks for a celebration. For one night, American jazz filled the air. Germans clapped and whistled, amazed to hear the music they had been told was decadent. A prisoner later wrote, "They told us jazz was filth. But I heard it on my birthday, and I could not stop tapping my foot. It was joy, pure and true." Some guards even sang. One, a son of German immigrants, joined the prisoners in Stille Nacht during a December birthday. For the men, it felt like a bridge across the barbed wire. Farmers, too, joined in quietly. On work details, they slipped prisoners a peach, a slice of bread, or even a small cake baked at home. These gifts, given with no expectation, were remembered for decades. A farmer's wife recalled years later, "My boy was overseas. I thought someone's boy's here too, so I baked him a cake. Enemy or not, a birthday is a birthday." The shock was profound. The men had expected indifference or cruelty. Instead, the enemy remembered their birthdays with gestures that felt impossibly human. Guards noted the change in morale. Reports mentioned prisoners were calmer, more cooperative after celebrations. Respect had grown, not from force, but from shared humanity. One American officer admitted privately, "They are our enemies." But when you watch a man turn 21 or 30 behind wire, you realize war cannot erase birthdays. It cannot erase being human. For the Germans, this kindness struck deeper than any propaganda. Birthdays were not only allowed, they were honored, even by those in charge of their captivity. It was a revelation that left them questioning. If their captors could treat them this way, what else had they been wrong about? And soon the celebrations would grow even larger, with entire barracks transforming birthdays into festivals of song, theater, and unforgettable joy behind barbed wire. By 1944, birthdays in the camps had grown from quiet gestures into full-scale events. With time, creativity, and scraps of material, prisoners turned barracks into stages and birthdays into festivals. Men with artistic talent painted banners on old sheets. Others built props from wood, cardboard, or tin. For one night, a plain wooden hut became a theater, lit by lanterns and buzzing with anticipation. The prisoners performed plays, folk tales, comedies, even Shakespeare translated into German. Birthdays became occasions for performance, laughter, and applause. One diary described it: "We laughed until we cried. For a few hours the wire vanished, and we were not prisoners, but men in a village hall." Music filled the evenings. Birthday concerts were arranged, with prisoners playing folk songs, hymns, and even American tunes learned from the guards. Harmonicas, violins, and handmade drums set the rhythm. The camps sometimes allowed Red Cross packages to provide instruments and costumes. For prisoners, these were not luxuries, but lifelines, tools to reclaim their culture and dignity. A guard noted in his report, "The Germans held a concert tonight for a birthday." Their discipline in organizing it was remarkable. They applauded like civilians at home. Farmers and townsfolk sometimes heard the echoes of music drifting from the camps. They paused in their fields or on porches, astonished that the enemy celebrated so joyfully behind wire. Birthdays also became moments of resistance. Prisoners staged satirical skits, mocking Hitler or German officers, safe in the knowledge that here, far from the Reich, they could laugh at what once terrified them. One prisoner later admitted, "For my birthday, they performed a play that mocked our commanders. We laughed until our sides ached. It was the greatest gift to laugh freely." The festivals gave the men something beyond celebration. They restored community, identity, and the sense that life continued, even in captivity. A veteran reflected years later, "Birthdays in camp were not small things. They reminded us that we were alive, that we had survived another year." And as the theater and music grew louder, the line between survival and living blurred. Behind barbed wire, birthdays had become not just days, but milestones of hope. And soon the celebrations would take on even deeper meaning when prisoners began to compare them with the birthdays their families were enduring back in war-torn Germany. As birthdays became traditions in the camps, a haunting thought lingered. What of their families back in Germany? Were their wives, children, or parents even alive to mark their days? Letters home were censored and slow, often arriving months late. When they came at all, they carried no mention of celebrations, no hint of birthdays behind barbed wire. One prisoner wrote privately in his diary, "I was given cake today, but my wife stands in a ruined city. My daughter has no candles. I ate with guilt. News of bombings weighed heavily. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin cities reduced to rubble. Families lived in basements, scraping for food, while their sons received pies and songs in America." A guard noted in his report, "Many Germans seem uneasy during celebrations. They eat, they laugh, but afterward they fall into silence. I believe they think of their homes." The prisoners often spoke of this guilt after festivities. Some said birthdays should be ignored out of respect for suffering families, but others argued the opposite, that celebrating was a way to stay alive, to return home with hope. One veteran later reflected, If we had not celebrated, we would have gone mad. Birthdays gave us something to cling to. We survived for those at home. Still, the comparisons were painful. In the camps, prisoners shared chocolate, music, even laughter. In Germany, their families endured hunger, ration cards, and sirens in the night. One diary recorded bitterly, "I ate better on my birthday as a prisoner than my mother did in freedom." What irony! And yet the guilt never erased the gratitude. The prisoners knew they were lucky. They were alive, fed, and remembered even by their enemies. Birthdays became paradoxes, moments of joy shadowed by sorrow, moments of hope haunted by homesickness. But in that tension lay their deepest lesson, that even in captivity, life moved forward. The calendar could not be erased, nor could the human need to be remembered. And as 1945 approached, birthdays in the camps would take on one final, profound layer of meaning when the war ended, and men began to look toward freedom. For their last birthdays in captivity would not only be celebrations, they would be farewells. Spring 1945. News spread quickly through the camps. Germany was collapsing. The Reich's armies were retreating, cities were in ruins, and Hitler's rule was nearing its end. The war was almost over. For prisoners, birthdays in 1945 carried a new weight. Each one might be their last in captivity. Each celebration was no longer only about survival, but about anticipation of going home. One diary recorded, "Today I turned 25. My friends sang, the guards allowed music, and I ate cake made of scraps. Yet my heart beat with one thought. Next year I will celebrate in freedom." The barracks were filled with cautious joy. Men laughed, exchanged handmade gifts, and whispered plans for the future. They dreamed aloud of rebuilding homes, of holding children they had never met, of birthdays to come in a Germany that no longer existed as they remembered it. Guards noticed the change. Prisoners seemed restless, hopeful, sometimes even distracted. Some tried to mark their birthdays with larger gatherings, as if to leave one last memory behind the wire. Farmers continued their kindness. On birthday mornings, a peach, an egg, or even a pie would appear as if by magic. The prisoners, touched beyond words, began calling these moments farewell gifts. One American officer later wrote, "I shook hands with a German on his birthday in April 1945. I told him he'd be home soon. He wept openly. It was the first time I saw a prisoner cry from joy." As the war ended, some prisoners celebrated their birthdays with prayers of thanks. Others simply stared at the horizon, imagining ships that would soon carry them eastward. The barbed wire still stood, but hope had pierced it. Birthdays were no longer reminders of captivity. They had become countdowns to freedom. A veteran recalled, "My last birthday in America was the strangest of all. I laughed, I ate, I celebrated, but I knew tomorrow or the next day it might all be over." The last birthdays were bittersweet. They were filled with laughter, but also with a kind of sorrow, for the men realized they would soon leave behind the only peace they had known in years. Some prisoners admitted they would miss America. Not the barbed wire, not the captivity, but the kindness, the humanity, and the strange birthdays that had kept them alive. These final celebrations became farewell rituals, proof that even in the final days of war, life still demanded to be honored. And as the ships prepared to sail, prisoners carried with them more than belongings. They carried memories of birthdays that had defied hatred and proved that even in captivity, humanity endured. By late 1945 and into 1946, the camps emptied. Trains carried the prisoners to ports, where Liberty ships waited to return them to a homeland they no longer recognized. On the journey home, birthdays were marked quietly on deck, a piece of bread, a handshake, a whispered song. But the men spoke often of the strange birthdays they had celebrated in America. One veteran recalled, "I left the U.S. with a wooden pipe, carved for me on my 30th birthday. I smoked it on the ship home, and I thought it is not only tobacco I taste, but friendship." When they arrived in Germany, shock replaced joy. Cities lay in ruins. Families lived in basements, surviving on rations. For many, their homes no longer existed. Men who had eaten cakes and pies in captivity now returned to families who had gone years without sugar. The guilt resurfaced, stronger than ever. A former POW confessed, "I celebrated my 21st birthday with music and chocolate in Texas. My brother spent his in Berlin under the bombs. I never forgave myself for that, yet even with the guilt, the memories lingered." Birthdays in captivity became stories told quietly. To children and grandchildren, tales not of suffering, but of unexpected kindness from enemies. Some men stayed in contact with American guards or farmers. Letters crossed the Atlantic, often with photographs. A few even returned years later, visiting the camps where they had once sung and laughed behind wire. For others, the memories were harder. They buried their diaries, kept their stories hidden, fearing they would not be believed or worse, condemned for speaking well of the enemy. Historians later found these accounts in archives, tucked into boxes marked personal papers. They revealed a truth unspoken at the time, that birthdays in American captivity had given men hope when war had taken everything else. One diary ended with this line, "I will never forget the Americans who remembered my birthday. They gave me back my life, 1 year at a time." But for every man who shared his story, another stayed silent. The memories of laughter and song in captivity often clashed with the suffering they returned to at home. The legacy of those birthdays lived in paradox: joy remembered, guilt endured, kindness carried like a secret. And yet, even in silence, the truth remained. Birthdays in captivity had left a mark deeper than any wound of war. Decades passed. The war faded into history. But for the men who had lived through it, the memories of captivity never left. Among them, the strangest memories were often of birthdays. They remembered the paper stars hung on barrack walls, the bread shared like cake, the laughter that echoed across barbed wire. They remembered the guards who gave cigarettes, the farmers who gave pies, the children who pressed gifts through fences. One former POW, interviewed in old age, said simply, "It was the enemy who remembered my birthday." That truth has stayed with me longer than the war itself. In Germany, these stories became part of family lore. Sons and daughters grew up hearing of the days their fathers were treated not as captives, but as men allowed to celebrate life even in prison. Some veterans even returned to America. They visited the farms where they had once worked, or the towns near the camps. Old men embraced, recalling birthdays spent together in the strangest of circumstances. Historians later uncovered diaries, photographs, and letters that confirmed these tales. They showed a hidden side of the war, not of battles, but of humanity persisting in the unlikeliest places. A guard's journal read, "I saw Germans celebrate a birthday with bread and song. In that moment, I no longer saw enemies. I saw only men, grateful to be alive, for the prisoners. Those days became a lesson, carried for life. War had stripped them of freedom, dignity, and homeland. But birthdays reminded them that even in captivity, their identity could not be erased. A veteran summed it up best. "Every birthday was proof that we survived another year." and survival in those times was victory. The legacy of birthdays in captivity is not written in military records. It is written in hidden diaries, in whispered memories, and in the quiet smiles of men who live to tell their stories. It is a legacy of small gifts, of shared laughter, of humanity that refused to die even in the shadow of war. German POWs were shocked to celebrate birthdays in U.S. prison camps. But in that shock, they found something greater than surprise. They found dignity, hope, and a reminder that even enemies can honor life. And so, behind barbed wire, far from home, they discovered that birthdays were not just days on a calendar. They were declarations of survival and proof that humanity endures even in war. A quiet legacy carried across oceans and generations.